My name is Nancy Fisher. Today's date is November 6, 2023. I am here to interview the Holocaust survivor, William Freund, in his home in Chatham, New Jersey, United States of America. The language of the interview is English. I'm starting off the interview with a discussion with two of his daughters. The woman in front of me is his daughter, Sandy Coonley, and the language of this interview is English. My name is Nancy Fisher. Today's date is Monday, November 6th, 2023. I am here to interview the Holocaust survivor, William Freund, in his home in Chatham, New Jersey, USA. Before I interview Mr. Freund, I'm going to be speaking with his two daughters individually, and this is Sandy Coonley on my right, who will be talking to me. The language of the interview is English. Good morning, Sandy. Thank you for speaking with me before your father begins his interview. Can you tell me in your own words how you remember learning about your father's story and the fact that he had escaped with his family, his parents, from Germany in 1937? When did you first learn? What was the impact of that on you?
I don't think I have a memory of first learning. I think I have a memory of just always knowing. It was just part of their story. It wasn't like I was suddenly one day sat down and told, this is what happened to us in Germany. It was part of who we were.
How would that be shared with you? In what context?
It was shared in limited context. Obviously, we knew the story of Paula's Lebkuchen in terms of what the family encountered during Nazi Germany while they were living there prior to coming here was not an openly discussed. It was given in bits and pieces. It wasn't until they were, I would say, till grandchildren came around that we totally knew the whole story. We had gone to Germany on a roots trip it was right after my bat mitzvah, so I was 12, and we saw where they lived and we heard some of it. And then later, when my husband's and my children were about the same age, my husband and our two sons, we went with my parents to Germany, and that's when we learned more. We always knew about the family history going way back in Germany, going back decades and decades and hundreds of years. What actually happened in terms of their initial life, how it was impacted, was really told to us a little later in life.
Was that family trip you just mentioned the one where the Stolpersteiner were set?
No, that was just, my sister and I just did that this past summer.
But what was it like in trying to understand what your father and, your father and mother, had been through growing up with other children?
Well, I knew my story was always, my family story, not my personal story, was very different than the kids I encountered. Our household, I think, was German, Jewish, American, as opposed to American first, from how we ate to the bedding on the sheets. Because they did duvet covers. We didn't do the typical American single sheet. To what we ate a lot of German cuisine, particularly when there were family gatherings or going to my grandmother. But first and foremost, we were German Jews. My generation, my siblings and I, were really first generation Americans.
What language did they speak to you?
We spoke English. They did not bring us up bilingual. I do not speak German.
Do you read about the Holocaust?
Yes, and of course we went, I don't know if you know, we went to Jewish day school I went from 1 through 6. So of course, you know, we learned about more, I would say I learned about more of the atrocities by going to Jewish day school and by going to Jewish summer camp. We would go to sleepaway camp. And I learned more of what other families encountered and the end of family lines because of it. My father made it over here. They were not, and his family, they were not put in a concentration camp. So I learned more details of that through my schooling.
Do you see films about the Holocaust?
I will. I do have a hard time with it. I saw a lot growing up. There was always subjects in school, and then when you went to summer camp, and I watched a lot there. And, it is hard because we lost family over there, too. So it is very difficult for me to watch it, but I will.
Today is a month from the attack in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's 1 month of the day.
Yeah, I believe so.
What has this past month been for you?
It's been scary. I mean, we don't have any living relatives in Israel anymore. We did. I do have a very close friend, and her family made Aliyah to Israel, and her children have been called up to the military, who I've known since they were little, like 5-year-olds, as well as the anti-Semitism that it has resurfaced. I don't know if resurfaced is the right word. It's not. I worry about my children and my grandchildren, what it means for them. You see the swastikas are coming up again. The groups are forming even fuller, and it is really scary. And just the United States, the direction it's going, is reminiscent of Nazi Germany. And the biggest is I worry about my family.
What do you mean? What do you mean by the direction of the United States?
Well, where there's a lot of bigotry and hatred, and trying to force people to define them by either their religion, their nationality, and that was Nazi Germany. You were Jewish or you weren't. You were, it didn't matter if your German roots went back, to the 1600s. Being Jewish was what was held against you, and I worry for for Americans, and particularly the younger groups coming up, my grandchildren's ages. I don't want them to be defined only because they're Jewish.
Do you feel safe now?
I do. I do to some extreme. I mean, I don't worry about it on a daily basis. Again, I don't worry as much for myself as for my children and my grandchildren.
Would you like to say something to your father? He's not here in the room, but would you like to say
Well, I
something
have always...
about his doing the interview?
Yeah, and my father and I talked last night. We went out to dinner. And I think, I've always admired both my grandparents for what they did. I can't even imagine grabbing your 2 young children with $7 in your pocket, getting on a boat and coming to a country you don't even speak the language. I have tried to find in myself, would I be able to do that? And I guess you can't find that until the situation warrants it. My father always says, and has since I was a child, that he didn't have a childhood. His childhood first was, he had a few years in Germany where everything was great, and then all the horrific things he experienced in Nuremberg. And then he got here and he didn't have a childhood. He went to school, rode the subway, and he had to help in the family business. And that has always been something that I would love to be able to give back to him. And there's no way to give him a childhood. And I know that's what he wishes he had, either there or even when he got here. And that has weighed heavy on my heart my whole life.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No. Thank you. Appreciate your doing this.
I'd like to introduce Nancy Heller, who is Mr. Freund's daughter, and ask her a few questions. Thank you for coming today. I'll start out by asking the same question that I asked your sister about how you learned about your father's history and how you absorbed it as a child growing up.
My parents were very open about their escapes from Nazi Germany, both my mother and my father. And it was just a part of our growing up. I don't remember a time when I didn't know the family stories. As time went on, we learned more and more detail, but it was just part of our growing up to know that they both left Germany, that my father left Germany as a 11-year-old boy, a 12-year-old boy, 11-year-old boy, excuse me.
Did you have friends growing up whose parents were also survivors?
No, not really. We grew up in a pretty mixed neighborhood. There was the family across the street that was Greek. There was the Italian family. There was one other Jewish family in the neighborhood. But as far as I knew, growing up, we were pretty much the only family with parents who escaped Nazi Germany. And later I learned that the kids in the neighborhood thought that visiting our house was like visiting another country. That when they stepped through the doors of our home, it was as if they went elsewhere. And even our kids, the first time they went to Germany, they said, this is just like our grandparents' house. And I had the same reaction too when I went. There was a familiarity with Germany that is visceral, that you go and the food is the same 6-minute eggs, the same desserts, the same potato salad, and the same bedding. And it was almost weird to go and feel at home in a country that kicked your parents out. And it was a really strange feeling for me. I went several times with my parents to Germany. First, sometimes alone, sometimes as a couple. We went with our children. And each time I felt that familiarity. One of the early times I went, I couldn't sleep there. I felt like Hitler was going to jump out of the closet. It was irrational, of course he was dead, but it was this horror of, as soon as the sun set, not being able to sleep there. I think since the last of the grown-ups who could have served in World War II has died, I have been able to sleep in Germany, just knowing that anybody who voted for the Nazi Party or served in the army is now dead has helped me sleep there when I go and visit.
Your sister made reference to the trip that you took this past summer to lay the Stolpersteiner.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like for you?
I have been interested in the family history for a long time, and ever since we went, I started taking notes, documenting it, taking pictures, putting photo journals together, and really trying to understand our family history, the history of Germany. And as it has become easier and easier to do research, I really started digging into genealogy work. And the summer before this, I went to Germany, having done a lot of research on the family history. I went to meet with many of the archivists and really to get as much information as I possibly could. And when I came back last summer, not the summer before, my father said, maybe we ought to honor the people who were murdered in the Holocaust. And I said, you know, that's a really good idea. Germany is starting to remember its past in a really positive way. But in order to do that, I had to figure out all the people who were murdered. And so that took me on a whole nother gigantic project, which was to figure out who died, contact the appropriate cities in Germany, and figure out how they could be honored. The first one, of course, was my father's Aunt Carolina. And she was blind, and America would not accept anyone who could be a public charge. I contacted the city of Nuremberg, very nice gentleman, and the key is to agree on where the person last chose to live. And we had a little bit of a disagreement, but in the end, the gentleman said, you're right. She really did live her entire adult life in Nuremberg, and they agreed to put down a Stolperstein. I created a memorial. In a way, we had a funeral for her, and I had a pamphlet that I prepared with her photograph, with poems. I wrote a biography of her in English and in German. I've been studying German for the last 7 years so that I could, which I'll get into maybe in a little bit, but anyway, I was able to talk to all the people who were standing there listening to give her biography in the language that the people standing there could understand. And then in Munich, where they don't put down stumbling stones or Stolpersteine, they put memorials either on the side of a building or on a pole. It was a really emotional experience for me. I had a couple of times when I just completely broke down. One of them was in Munich, when the owner of the building came, and we were putting the memorial on the side of the building for a couple of family members, and something triggered in me. It was almost like they were so dressed up, they had driven from Austria to come, and my husband had tugged on my sleeve and said, the owners are here, they don't speak English, you really need to go over and talk to them. And I looked at them, and they looked like such beautiful, well-dressed Germans, and it struck me that they looked like they could have jumped from the 1930s. And I absolutely just completely broke down. And it took me a little bit to recover myself, to be able to speak to them and thank them, because the building owner needs to give permission to put up a memorial on the side of the building. And in cases where they don't, they put up a stone, a pillar. But when the building owner agrees, it can go on the side of the building. And it was an incredibly emotional and draining experience.
I want to be sure to include, where did Aunt Caroline die?
She died in Theresienstadt. Some of the other family members there died all over the place. Some were on a train where when they got off, they were just shot. Others went to Riga. It was a variety of places where they died.
Who is the relative who died in Riga?
Well, the Riga relative is actually going to be honored next May in Nuremberg. My father's Uncle Max and his wife Bella.
And according to all the work that you did, there's another relative, a cousin, who perished?
So there, Carolina had a daughter and a son. The daughter was Irina, and the son was Siegfried, Stephen, in America, who we all knew and had Passover with. He became part of the family. Carolina's daughter wouldn't leave her, and so she died as well. And she died, her husband died, her husband's 2 other brothers and a sister died, and their daughter, 9-year-old Annalisa, also died. And so we had 7 memorials in Munich, and then the one for Carolina in Nuremberg.
That's Lieselette, is that written?
Lieselotte Freund will be next summer in Aschaffenburg, and she's a different cousin. And then I wrote biographies of all of them in German, in English. We said Kaddish. I had it printed in German, English, and Hebrew. And I sang Tzadi Katamar to the Lewandowski tune, the German composer's tune in Germany.
We're a month into the war. And it happened since I first met your father, you and your father, here in this house. How has this last month been for you, and what's your concern been for your father?
This is really, as my dad has said, is a reminder of what happened 80 years ago in Nazi Germany. And it's frightening for all of us. Jew hatred around the world is on the rise. We feel it here. There's a policeman outside every synagogue. Many people are afraid to wear a Star of David's or a yarmulke kippah on their heads. And it's frightening. And the reminders to 80 years ago are all around us. I think what's given us some comfort over the years has been the state of Israel. And now that the state of Israel is under siege and forever changed, October 7th will be remembered, like many of the moments in American history, as having changed so many lives and affected us all deeply, that a group of people, terrorists, would come in and murder innocent men, women, and children. We still have some distant family in Israel. We have a lot of friends in Israel. I spoke to a friend yesterday, and while we're on the phone, she's asking her husband if the siren went off. Was that a bomb scare? Do we need to go to the bomb shelter? She said to me. I said, look, you need to do what you have to do. So yes, I find it really frightening. But what I find a little encouraging is the reaction of the country of Germany. There was a video of, I think, the vice chancellor giving a talk about supporting Israel. Occasionally I go online and read the newspaper in my mother's hometown. And 80 years ago, in 1933, there's a picture of the local townspeople, saluting. It's huge in the town square. And yesterday I pulled up an article that in that same town square is flying an Israeli flag. And the local priest talked about how important it was to support Jews, to be against Jew hatred. And I think to myself, if only my grandfather, who had to run from this town, were alive today, what would he think to see an Israeli flag flying with a Magen David on it compared to somebody who came to murder him? I can't imagine what he would think of such a thing, and how far Germany has come to acknowledge what they did. To me, that is remarkable. Yes, Germany has problems. Yes, the Palestinians are marching in Germany as well, but it is against the law to be an anti-Semite in Germany.
The anniversary of Kristallnacht is upon us this week.
Yes.
What do you think might happen?
I think that Jews around the world are going to worry. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were some action by people who hate Jews. People like to make a point. I don't know why Jews have been hated so much throughout the centuries. I think there are a lot of hypotheses about why that is. But Kristallnacht is a night for all of us to be careful.
Before we end this part of the interview, I'd like to ask you to describe the jewelry that's hanging around your neck and what it means to you.
Yes. So I have a few things that I inherited from my parents and grandparents. One of them is this beautiful necklace. It looks like solid gold. It's actually costume jewelry. And I have a photograph of my great-grandmother wearing it. And I'm really proud. My great-grandmother, Selma Grunstein, she moved to Haifa in 1937, I believe, with some of the family. And she was a businesswoman. Her husband had died, and she ran a local shoe store. And she ran it on her own. And by all accounts, she was a really good businesswoman. And I find when I wear it, I feel like I get some energy from her, even though I never met her. I think I would have loved her. My mother also gave me this beautiful bracelet, and I can't remember whose it was, but you can see it's a beautiful silver bracelet, also from Germany. And for me, as the family historian now, to have these pieces and a few others at home of our family history means a great deal to me. And I don't know why I feel this need to document everything in our past, but I do. I feel that it's important. I think it's so important to honor the past. It's so important to remember the past. My father and I have been giving talks both in Germany, in German, and in English, obviously, here in America. This summer, I spoke to 200 students in Germany about the family's experience, trying to ensure that the next generation of Germans understands what happens and that their responsibility as future voters to be sure that they never elect a person like Adolf Hitler again. And it's been, a mission, something that I just feel that I've been driven to do. And my hope is that in some sort more way, it's part of Tikkun Olam, making the world a little bit better than the one we left by helping people understand a little bit what happened. I guess there's one other thing I would add, that I think that for many of us who are the first generation to be born in the United States, whose parents fled, that it's really hard for us to imagine what our parents went through, leaving a country to go to a place that you don't know. You don't know how it works. You don't know how anything is, and you don't know the language. I've been studying German for 7 years. If I had to live day to day with the German I'm learning, it would be hard. And I understand why my grandfather had trouble learning English. I try to remember one word a day. Practically, he tried to remember 10. But I also think that one of the effects has been that everyone has hardships growing up, right? None of us go through life where every day is a picnic. But I think when you compare it to what our parents went through, that we've all had a bit of a reluctance to come to terms with some of our own hardships, because in a way nothing could be worse than what they went through. And I think that that's pretty universal, since I had no friends growing up who were like me. I have since met many, and we all have this same feeling that anything we experienced, anything negative, anything difficult, probably, most likely, maybe wasn't as difficult, but we had trouble verbalizing it. And I think many of us are working to understand that dynamic and what that means to us.
Thank you very much. We're going to speak to your father shortly.
Great. I think that'll be great.
My name is Nancy Fisher. I'm continuing the interview, which started out with Mr. Freund's two daughters, Nancy and Sandy, and this is Mr. Freund. Today's date is November 6, 2023. I'm here to interview Mr. Freund in his home in Chatham, New Jersey. The language of the interview is English, and the interview is being conducted for the USC Schiller Foundation. My name is Nancy Fisher. Today's date is November 6th, 2023. I'm here to interview the Holocaust survivor, Mr. William Freund, in his home in Chatham, New Jersey, USA. The language of this interview is English, and the interview is being conducted for the USC Shoah Foundation. Good morning, Mr. Freund.
Good morning, Nancy Fisher.
I'm going to ask you some simple biographical questions
Go ahead.
at the beginning of the interview, before we get into your story. Please tell me your full name.
It's William Kurt Freund.
And what was your name at birth?
It was a very Teutonic name of Kurt Wilhelm Freund. It was much too Teutonic, much too German in World War II, so I changed the name.
And where were you born?
In Nuremberg, Germany.
And what is the date you were born?
September the 4th, 1926, which makes me today 97 years old.
Were you ever known by any other name? Like
Never.
Nick?
No,
Like a nickname?
no, 2 was enough.
Please tell me your father's name.
It was Hugo Freund
And where was your father born?
in a little town called Kleinwallstadt in Germany.
And your mother's name?
It was Paula
And her maiden name?
Grünstein.
And where was Paula born?
She was in a beautiful town, little town called Miltenberg in Germany.
Were there any other members of your immediate family?
I had a sister by the name of Margot Spiegel. That was her married name. Born Margot Freund.
Were you older or younger?
I was younger.
I'd like to know the names of your grandparents. Your paternal, your grandfather,
It was Liebmann Freund,
and his wife,
Sarah.
and your maternal grandfather.
His name was Willy Grünstein. In fact, I'm named after him. William, for Willie. And he was born, as far as I know, in Miltenberg.
And his wife, your
Well,
maternal grandmother.
wait, I'm trying. It was Sarah.
In Nuremberg, what is your, how would you describe your memory of the home in which you grew up?
It was a very warm home. It was a happy marriage of my parents. I was very lucky in selecting my parents. They were very good parents to me. And they saved my life by emigrating to America, of course. So, but once the Nazis took over, and even before Hitler was declared the Chancellor of Germany, I was very uncomfortable in the home in Germany, in Nuremberg. I sensed the danger, and I can tell you some stories to prove it, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yes, we will. Did you grow up in a house or an apartment?
Well, first it was a house out in the suburbs, and I have to assume that my parents were relatively well off. But we moved into an apartment around 1932 near the railroad station in Nuremberg, So I have to assume it, in retrospect, that my father had encountered some setbacks. It was not a particularly attractive place. It was a walk-up. And I do know that my father had invested in stocks and lost his good part of his assets in the 1929 crash. And then came the Great Depression in the world and also in Germany. And then finally, my father could no longer do business with Gentiles. And so I have to assume that, in a sense, we were pauperized by these events and had to change our venue.
What was your father's business?
He was a merchant. He was in leather goods and in toys. Nuremberg is to this day the toy capital of the world. And there is an annual conference meeting that attracts toy manufacturers and buyers and sellers from all over the world. And he was in that business as far as I know.
Did he have his own place of business, his own store, or did he travel, or?
He did not travel. He did not have a store. I believe he did business from home. He may have had one at one time. I believe he had to give it up. I was 11 years old when we left, so we are talking now about when I was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, and he did not talk about business at home.
What did the apartment look like?
It looked very nice. It was nicely furnished. We were allowed to take a crate with us, and some of the furniture I still have. It was very attractive furniture. Traditional furniture, not modern. And we were comfortable at one time.
In this apartment, where did you sleep
I had a separate bedroom,
from your sister?
yes.
So I can imagine what we would call a 3-bedroom.
I would imagine, yes.
Did your mother and father have anybody working for them in the apartment?
No. Whether she had a cleaning lady, I don't remember.
And what about a cook?
No, definitely not a cook.
Why do you
She
say
was
that?
the cook. I can see her in the kitchen cooking, and she had a particular talent for baking. And she was a marvelous baker. Not a particularly good cook in retrospect, but she was an excellent baker.
What are your memories of the baking that she did?
Oh, Apfelkuchen or apple cake, and cheesecake or Käsekuchen. All kinds of little pastries. Yeah, she was very accomplished in baking.
What was the immediate neighborhood like?
The neighborhood was in the apartment that we moved to, the second place that I mentioned. The neighborhood was not very prosperous. It was near the railroad station and the railroad tracks. So I have to assume we moved there out of necessity and not choice of my parents.
Did you have a pet?
Pardon?
Did you have a pet?
No, no, never had a pet. I'm not a dog or cat person.
Were you the beneficiary of your father's business in terms of toys that you had?
We brought along one toy, which was a car that never left the table, a wind-up toy. I know my father brought with him, thinking it might provide an opportunity in America for production and sale, but that never occurred.
How did your family practice its Jewish identity?
Well, in a sense, I'm a product of a mixed marriage. My father, of course, was Jewish, so was my mother, but my father was a Reformed Jew. My mother was Orthodox. Of course, there was no conservative in Germany. But it was such a good marriage that my father went on occasion to the Orthodox, but he also went to the Reformed. And I went with them to both places. I was influenced by both. And I will remember one time we went to the Reformed synagogue on Yom Kippur, the holiest day, the day of fasting, and you fast the entire day. And the service, the Reformed service, ended at midday. And my father and his friends, this was either before Hitler or just at the beginning, they were, as usual, they went to a hotel, a nearby hotel, to have lunch. And when they walked in, the clerk at the desk welcomed them and he said, "The men who fast eat upstairs." And so we did. Yeah, so my mother, we were modern Orthodox, I would say in today's terms. But I loved the Orthodox service too, because I loved to sing. And I was in the children's choir in the Orthodox synagogue. The Orthodox synagogue there was nothing like the Orthodox, let's say, Chabad service in America. It was more or less what we might call conservative. And I loved the service. And I loved to sing, and I, in my mind, still sing some of the songs, some of the prayers of my very early days in that synagogue. And one of the things that we sang in the children's choir was a song called Tzadik HaTomer, written by the German cantor Lewandowski, who was the cantor in Berlin. And I told my daughter, who has a good singing voice, to sing that song at my funeral. And it goes like this. Would you like to hear?
I would.
Tzadik HaTomer Yizke Shezulim, etc., etc. It's a beautiful melody. As I said, my favorite piece of liturgical music.
How was Shabbat observed in your
Yes,
home?
we observed. Mother baked a challah, and we had a Friday night meal. Saturday morning, my mother would go to services, not my father. But we did things like turning on the lights, for example, and other. And we would write on paper, whatever. So It was modern orthodoxy tending towards conservatism.
What was a typical Shabbat dinner like in your home?
Oh, of course, it had to be chicken. Yeah,
How was the table set?
it was set in with a, yeah, it was set in a very traditional way, with the challah and the challah cover, and the glass of wine, and we would say the kiddush, you know, and you knew it was Friday night.
What about Hanukkah?
Oh, it was a very minor holiday, and we would get a piece. We would get some Lebkuchen as a present, which is a ginger cookie for which Nuremberg was internationally famous. It's, tell the truth, it's a Christmas cookie, a ginger cookie. And I'll have more to say about that later on. But we would get a Lebkuchen for Hanukkah. It was such a minor holiday. It became a major holiday only in America after the kids complained. My neighbor here, my Gentile neighbor, the kids get presents, and we don't. But for us in Nuremberg, it was a very minor holiday.
And Passover?
Yeah, we observed Passover with matzahs, and we read the Haggadah. We would read that on Passover night. Yeah, so we adhered to those major traditions.
What was the language that your parents spoke to you?
German, only German. Deutsch.
What's your clearest memory of friendships that you had growing up as a little boy?
Yes, I had the friends I had were they were colleagues in school. What would you call them? School friends, school companions. I guess there was Werner. They're all gone now, but those who emigrated to America, I maintained relations, contact with.
What can you tell me about the first school that you attended?
It was a public school in Germany. We were not many Jewish kids. We were maybe 3 or 4, a class of maybe 15, or maybe less than that. And yeah, we were prominently Jewish in the class until this comes later in my story. We were kicked out of public school altogether. All the Jewish boys and girls. We had to go to a Jewish school. My parents had to find a Jewish school for me then. And the only comparable school was in Fürth, the next town. So I had to take a streetcar, and we got very rigorous instruction there in secular subjects as well as Jewish subjects. Henry Kissinger went to the same school, by the way, but he's older than I am, so he was not a classmate of mine.
When you went to public school first, how would you get there? Would you go alone? Would your parents, your mother?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm not sure. Early on, of course, when I was a toddler, or whatever you might call it, yeah, my mother would take me there, and later on, I believe I walked it. But later in the Jewish school, it was a distance to travel each day. I had to take the streetcar. And I remember that better because I was older. I took the streetcar to the Plata, which was a central point in Nuremberg, and from there took another streetcar to Fürth. So that was quite distant. But it was a very good school, the Jewish school. It was we got rigorous instruction.
If we can talk about some happier times before then, how were your birthdays celebrated?
Oh yes, we celebrated birthdays indeed, and we got toys and all kinds of presents. Yeah, they were major holidays were birthdays. Mm-hmm. And they would sing songs like Hoch soll er leben, dreimal hoch. That was the happy birthday in German.
What can you remember about, let's say, loving Nuremberg before the Nazis came to power?
I don't know that I love Nuremberg. It's a beautiful medieval town, which in January 1945, I believe, just as the war ended, was firebombed by the British and 90% destroyed. And
But the environment in which you grew up, let's call it the tender.
oh, I
safe-
walked all over freely until the Nazis, of course. And it was my hometown.
Did you have a favorite season there? Season of the year?
No, I don't remember that. Certainly not the winter, for reasons that I will tell about in a story in a little bit too.
So in 1933, you are 7, right? When the
Yeah.
Nazis come to power.
Correct?
How does their presence come into your life, into your vision, into your daily life?
I can answer that with a very vivid illustration. In Nuremberg, the Nazis staged a party rally every year. It attracted about 1 million Germans who yelled their allegiance to Adolf Hitler. And they would march down the streets of Nuremberg and past our window. And I would stand at the window looking out as they sang, "May the Jewish blood spurt, and everything will be twice as good." That's an English translation of that murderous gang song.
Can you say it in German?
Yes? I have to think for a moment. Wenn das jüdische Blut spielt, dann ist es zweimal so gut. And then my mother would come and pull me away from the window and draw the curtains. So you can see, I was a frightened young boy. Once Hitler took over, and the marchers were not ordinary people, they were the SS, and they were the stormtroopers dressed their part. It was a very scary scene. And it would be a very scary scene today for me as an adult. So some years later, my parents would send me out of town when the Nuremberg Nazi Party rallies took place. They would send me to grandmother in Miltenberg for safety.
If you were surrounded by these threatening songs and sounds,
Yes.
what about color? What's your vivid recollection of color?
Color? Did you say color?
Yes.
Well, the color was brown, the brown shirts.
What other colors would have dominated the streets?
Oh, it was all brown. Brown shirts, brown trousers.
What about flags?
Oh,
The Nazi flag.
oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. They would carry the Nazi flag. Visualize 500,000 of these characters descending on Nuremberg at that time. That was very frightening. And that is very strongly in my memory. And yeah, and there were other incidents in Nuremberg that added to my fright.
Can you describe them?
Well, I'll describe them. One day, maybe 1933, 34, I walked down the street of Nuremberg all by myself. There was an early Nazi period, and some young kids followed me. Maybe I should call them hoodlums. And they called me Jewish pigs. I don't know to this day how they knew that I was Jewish. And they overtook me and forced me into a wooden crate in Nuremberg, and I think most of Germany. They had wooden boxes, wooden crates, large crates filled with sand, which they would use to prevent people from sliding on the ice. Well, they forced me into one of these crates and closed a very heavy lid. And here I was, a youngster. The lid was so heavy I couldn't lift it and I couldn't escape. In my fright, I yelled, "Help! Hilfe! Bitte, Hilfe! Bitte, Hilfe!" And a man came along and lifted the cover for me and helped me step out. It was a terribly frightening incident, as you can imagine, all alone as a youngster in Nuremberg. And it was such a traumatic event that to this day I cannot pull any. I can't be in dark places, and I can't wear clothing that pulls over my head. I don't own any T-shirts, I don't own any pullovers, and to this day I have memories and dreams about that event. That was one frightening thing. The other was some years later, maybe 19 36, I believe it was 36, my father was suddenly arrested by the Nazis while I was there. Other Jewish men from our synagogue were arrested. I think they used the membership of the synagogue to arrest the men. They were driven to the sports, a sports arena, and forced to run a track until they fell to the ground in exhaustion. And they were subjected to other indignities that I could not talk about today. Now I have to tell you that my father never, ever wanted to leave Germany before then. Our family, we have traced back, my daughter was a genealogist, traced back to 1773 in Germany. And I think our family in Germany actually, my father told me, goes back to the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. So we called ourselves German Jews, not Jewish Germans. German came first. We were loyal Germans. But when my father was arrested and subjected to these terrible indignities, from which he never really recovered, he was released on condition at that time that we leave. They were not yet murdering the Jews, but forcing them to leave. And my father then realized we couldn't stay. So that's another terribly searing memory that I have of my youth, because I was there when they arrested him. Of course, my father told my mother what had happened.
You previously said to me, I cannot remember Nuremberg without the Nazis.
Yeah, well,
Your own words.
it's very hard. I was very young before then.
When you felt threatened or frightened, who in your family supported you emotionally?
Definitely my parents. They were very good parents. And as I said, they even sent me out of town in some years of the rally, of the Nazi rally.
And what about Margot, your sister?
Yeah, she was sent out too. Yeah.
What was the impact on her? You know?
Yeah, she had the same experience. Unfortunately, she can't tell you that today.
Were you aware during that time of other groups that were being targeted by the Nazis?
No, it was the Jews. And you saw it everywhere. I mean, I remember the signs on the Jewish stores that said, "Don't buy here, Jewish ownership." And so it was obvious on every level. And then, of course, you know about the Nuremberg laws in 1935. Also, there was a rabid anti-Semitic newspaper in Nuremberg. So anti-Semitism was everywhere.
Are you talking about the Stürmer?
I'm talking about the Stürmer, yeah.
So it was everywhere. What does everywhere mean?
Well, you went outside on the street and encountered it. You encountered it even when you were home, because you were not safe inside your walls. So there was no escaping it.
Did your family have a radio?
Yes.
Did you have the opportunity to hear Hitler?
Yes, indeed. Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. We knew the score. And it happened very early in Nuremberg, even before Hitler became chancellor. So there was no doubt about it. And after the Nuremberg laws, of course, nobody could deny that Hitler was a racist, anti-Semitic. We didn't know yet that he would murder 6 million.
Do you have any memories of the Olympics in '36? Did that
I
come
think
to
we
you
were.
around
Yeah. When were the Olympics?
1936.
Yeah. No, no, I don't remember that. I think we were engaged in packing for our departure to America.
You and I spoke briefly when I first met you about gypsies.
Oh,
Gypsies.
Gypsies? Yes. I didn't know about gypsies.
And how they were marginalized.
Yes, I learned about that later. That was not so obvious as the persecution of the Jews.
They were the specific group
Yeah,
of people who were moved out of Berlin out of Berlin and Nuremberg when the
yeah,
Olympics took place.
yeah. But of course they were
Out of sight.
out of sight. Yeah.
So you were a child, and how did you learn from one day to the next that you were leaving?
My parents moved us out of town for that too. They didn't want the neighbors to know that we were leaving and possibly denounce us for whatever reason. And so we knew we were leaving, and our parents were packing up the crate. Of course, we could take clothing and we could take some furniture, but in terms of currency, there were exchange controls, and we were allowed to take, as I remember, $7. We were a family of 4, so we left poor without nothing in our pockets.
Were there possessions that your mother and father had to release to the Nazis before you left?
Well, you had to get a release rather, from the Internal Revenue Service, and you had to prove that you had no debts, particularly debts to not to other Jews, but to Christians or Gentiles, I should say. It was not so easy to get permission even to leave, unless you cleared all of these administrative agencies in Germany. Then, yeah, so they made it difficult. But we knew. Our parents told us.
What other preparation did your mother or father make before you left?
I don't know of any other than, well, of course we had to get a visa from America, which was not an easy thing. There were quotas to immigrate in America. Fortunately, the quota, at least in 1936 still, the quota for Germans to come to America was quite generous. But there were quotas not for Jews. There were quotas intended for Gentiles. But we could get a visa using available quotas still in 1936. I understand in 1937, 1938, it was practically impossible to come to America because Jews the quotas were much too small compared to the people who wanted to come. But anyway, my father had a distant cousin in America whose name was Louis Joseph. He worked for the meatpacking firm in Chicago. Forget the name right now. And my father wrote a letter to Louis Joseph. He had never met him, and asked if he would provide us with an affidavit, which you needed to come, in addition to the that is, you could only get a visa if you could prove that you would not become a burden on Americans. So this blessed man immediately sent us an affidavit, which the Americans rejected to our great dismay and disappointment, on the grounds that he had given so many affidavits before to relatives and other people from his hometown that the American government would not honor his affidavit any longer. Whereupon this man, if you can believe it, opened a bank account in our names and deposited a sum of money, and I don't know how much, to prove that we would not become a burden in America. And that's how we escaped from Germany. And I hope there's a special place in heaven, if there is a heaven, for this man, because he saved our life and many others. But I forgot what your question was. But that's how we managed to come.
I'd asked you whether your mother or your father had prepared in any way
Well,
for leaving.
that was the main preparation.
What about language?
None of us four knew a word of English. Absolutely none. And we knew nothing about American culture either. So we were coming to America without language, without American customs.
What about a skill?
And no special skill. My mother was a good baker. My father was a merchant. So, and we came in the midst of the Great Depression. It was worldwide. It was severe in America. And jobs were practically impossible to find it on arrival. We had relatives in America, and we stayed with them for maybe a week or two on arrival. And then my parents went looking for jobs. As I said, practically impossible in the Great Depression. Everybody else was looking for a job. But my father lucked out, and he found a job in the Jewish Memorial Hospital in New York City on 190th Street or thereabout, moving cadavers. My mother lucked out too somehow. She found a job in a lipstick factory. And I remember when she would come home on the subway, and I would be waiting for her, and her entire arm was red of lipsticks, but at least we were able to pay our bills.
Mr. Friend, why don't you take some water?
Yeah.
Sip. You've been talking for a while. Great. What about your mother and her love for baking? How did she bring that with her?
Well, I'll tell you that story. We knew we could bring no money to America. So my mother had an absolutely brilliant idea. In Nuremberg, there was a specialty cookie called Lebkuchen, based on a recipe about 500 years old. Originally concocted by priests. And it was a ginger cookie made on the base of what are called Oblaten, the same as are used in communion by the Catholic Church. And the recipe was a secret, like Coca-Cola syrup, it's passed on from one generation to another generation, or so I'm told. So was the recipe for Lebkuchen. And before, my mother knew that on our street there was a man, a pastry chef, who knew the recipe and worked for a company called Heberlein Metzger, the dominant manufacturer or baker of Lebkuchen. And she went to him and bribed him to reveal to her the recipe. And so we came with no money, but she had in her head the recipe. Not only did she have the recipe, the authentic Nuremberg Lebkuchen, called the Elisen Lebkuchen, need to know how to bake them. And I remember this pastry chef came into our kitchen in Nuremberg and taught my mother how to bake them. And my mother said, the Nazis cannot take away from her what she carries in her head. And she carried in her head that recipe, thinking that she might start baking Lebkuchen, which is primarily a Christmas cookie, a Christmas ginger cookie, in America. But we came without capital, without know-how how to do business. And furthermore, most important, the Germans exported Lebkuchen at Christmas time to America. And it would have been hard to compete with the German imports. So they didn't know the language or anything. They could not go into business. In 1939, the war started in Europe, and the Atlantic Ocean was mined by the Germans. And it became impossible for the Germans to export Lebkuchen to America at Christmas time. So by this time we had been in America a couple of years. They knew a little bit more of English, not my father so much, but my mother. I spoke it fluently by that time. And they started to bake Lebkuchen in their kitchen at home. until a neighbor denounced us to the Board of Health because it was illegal to bake commercially in a residence. So then my parents rented a store. Somehow, and I don't know how they financed it, got a baker's oven and a baker's mixing pan and started to bake Lebkuchen commercially. There was no competition anymore from Germany, and they began to sell them to department stores, Macy's, and so on, and fine delicatessen stores, not only in New York, but even elsewhere. They were looking to buy Lebkuchen, but they couldn't get them from Germany anymore. And so we became rather successful. I remember after school, every single day, I would work in the business. I didn't help in the manufacture because I was in the office. I handled all the correspondence at my tender age. I did answer all telephone calls and learned quite a bit about business even at that time. Just to tell you the ending of that story, the war, of course, ended in 1945. We continued to make Lebkuchen, but the Germans began to export them again. By 1950, our business had dwindled. Moreover, my father passed away in 1950 when he was only 57 years old, and I do think his beatings from the Nazis had something to do with his early death. And so my mother was struggling with a declining business at that time, and she sold the business to another company. But I might add that one reason for our success was that the New York Herald Tribune had a prominent article one day written by their food editor, whose name I shall never forget, Clementine Paddleford. And that article really put us on the map, and the New York Times ran an article a little bit later. So we really did very well from roughly 1939 to 1950, baking Lebkuchen.
And under what name was the
Oh, the name
sold?
was Paula's Lebkuchen. And I must tell you one other thing. When we first came, just so as not to forget, when we first came here to America, not knowing anything and not having any money, I was in Washington Heights, you know, we settled, and I saw some boys on Broadway with a shoeshine box. And I said to myself, I could do that too. So I got somehow a shoeshine box, put a sign on it, shoeshine, 1 nickel. That's what I charged in competition with the other boys. And sometimes I even got a dime from generous people. But I was happy to contribute to the family budget, whatever little money I took in. So we had progressed from shining shoes, and I had, and my parents, from menial labor, we had progressed quite considerably over time in America. America is the place where the dream was still alive.
What ship brought you to the United States?
It was the SS Georgic. It was a Cunard White Star Line Cunard White Star Line boat, and it's. I looked it up, and it was sunk in World War II. And we traveled. We didn't travel first class, but it was comfortable enough.
How would you describe, let's see, you were, in 1937, you came, so you're 11 or almost 12.
Correct.
Um,
Correct.
How would you describe what was so new and different for you as a kid?
It was hard. It was hard. They placed me. I went to PS 169 in New York City. Of course, they put me back. They gave me a test to answer to determine in which class to put me. I didn't understand a word of it, so they put me in a 4B. I made it up later, of course, but it took me maybe 6 months to learn enough English to follow the teacher, and that was the beginning of my education in America. It was nothing like the education I had in Germany, which was really quite a lot more rigorous.
Were there any memories of just having fun as a child that you couldn't have in the later years in Germany?
Well, in 4B, we still did a lot of playing, even with clay, but we never played in a school in Germany. But that later on, no.
What was it like to live without,
Oh, there was
without a
one. There
threat?
was one thing. I had a class in music, and I remember some of the tunes we listen to this day. It had a great influence on me, and I learned to appreciate classical music. And as a matter of fact, when I was about 18 or 19, I went to music school. My father insisted, I had a nice voice, and my father thought I could make it as a singer at the Metropolitan Opera. He had a tin ear he couldn't have heard. Anyway, but so I had some musical training, but I knew that was not in my future professionally.
Did your family carry on a Jewish observant life?
Yes, yeah, as I said, we lived in Washington Heights, and that was the German Jewish enclave with German butchers and German bakers. They called it the Third Reich, or they called it the Frankfurt on the Hudson, they called it. You must have heard that. Yeah. So, in fact, my father read the German newspaper each day, the Staatszeitung und Herald, and that's one reason he never learned to speak English fluently, because he didn't have to. Yeah, where did I start out on this?
No, I was asking you about, well, first of all, what was it like, to be a little boy again in a neighborhood without the fear around you?
Yeah, that was a revelation, I will tell you. The only fear was that I knew that financially we lived at the margin. And, being poor is can be a psychological problem. Until Paula's Lebkuchen. That was the name of our product. And we packaged them at the time in nice tin cans with the name prominently, Paula's Lebkuchen.
How did you get the bottom wafer?
That was no problem until World War II. And we didn't know where to get it. The Oblaten, the wafer on the bottom, the edible wafer. In fact, we put on the tin, do not peel the wafer, because Americans would think it was paper and they'd peel it off. Anyway, we didn't know where to get it, so we went to the Catholic Church. And we said, where do you get the Oblaten for your communion? And they told us that there was a place near Chicago where they could order them. So we followed up on that. And the only way we could get them was in large sheets. So we ordered those, and then we had to die cut the large sheets into the round format for the Lebkuchen. And after the war, when international commerce resumed, we got them again, yeah, now I remember, from Holland. Yeah.
I had asked you about resuming life as a Jewish family. Did you have a bar mitzvah?
Oh, absolutely.
Tell me about it.
Well, you know, I had a nice voice, and I could read the Hebrew, and so I did the entire Torah service and the Haftarah. It was a big event, followed by cookies and cognac, and that was it. That's all my parents could afford. But it was a memorable occasion nonetheless.
What synagogue?
It was in Washington Heights, congregation Emes Tzedek. The rabbi was Rabbi Max Koppel, who was a rabbi in Berlin. I believe he was a Reformed rabbi, but this was not a Reformed synagogue where I was bar mitzvah. It was an Orthodox, and he became a friend of mine. I was immensely fond of him. He encouraged me in many ways. And he was, I hate to tell you, he was murdered on the streets of Washington Heights. The way that happened, if you'd like to know, our services were conducted in the Audubon Hall. By the way, that's where Malcolm X was shot. There was a theater in the Audubon Hall downstairs, movie theater and plays. And each night, and then our congregation bought the building. And then our rabbi went every day to collect the revenue of the theater and deposit money into the synagogue's bank account. Apparently, the killers observed this, and after he had collected the money from the theater, they shot him in broad daylight on the streets of Broadway. They never got the killers. So many stories.
I think this would be a good time to take a pause,
Okay.
have a have a sandwich, right? Give you some energy to continue your
Okay,
very special story. And we'll stop for the time being.
sure.
This is part 2 of the interview today with Mr. William Freund for USC. If we can move ahead chronologically, do you have any memories of learning what happened in Europe, to the Jews of Europe when you were, in the United States? When did you learn about what had taken place there?
We did not know about the Holocaust. Now, I understand the American government knew about it, but we didn't. There was a publication widely circulated in Washington Heights among the German Jews called the Aufbau, which was a weekly newspaper. I believe weekly, maybe it was daily later. And Aufbau means reconstruction. And of course, every German Jew in Washington Heights read that paper because it told them about what was going on in Germany. And they didn't know either. At least they didn't publicize it if they did know. And so that was our conduit to the Jewish world outside. And I know my family read it, and I read it too. I also read the New York Times early on. I've read it most every day ever since. And so, yeah, I was pretty much informed about the world, but not about the Holocaust. And
what about the end of the war, 45?
Yeah, well, that's when the world learned about the barbaric treatment of the Jews. Yeah, that's when we found out, after the war, not during the war. Although I understand, frankly, that there was a delegation of the chief rabbi, so to speak, of New York, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who went to see Roosevelt and told him that a man had escaped from Auschwitz and made it his life's purpose to inform the world. And Rabbi Wise told Roosevelt about what was happening to Jews in Germany. And, well, Germany, Austria, Poland, yeah. But we did not know.
When did you know? And
Well,
how did you know it?
Well, then it made the newspaper. It was in the Aufbau and ultimately in the New York Times. And then it was common knowledge about, not right away, not in 1945, but maybe 46 thereafter. And we lost quite a few family members ourselves. Brother of my father and his whole family perished, and his sister, her family perished, and so on.
Nancy spoke about Caroline,
Caroline Lehmann.
right? And Lieselette Freund,
She was my
and Max Freund, and Max Freund.
and Caroline Lehmann. I choke up when I think of her. She lived around the corner from us in Nuremberg. And I remember her so fondly. She was my favorite aunt. And we looked after her. She, as I said, was around the corner. I would go over. She would take my hand and we'd walk on the street, and here I was 10 years old or so, and she would have complete confidence in crossing the street with me. And of course, she couldn't get out. The Americans wouldn't admit a blind person. And she ended up in Theresienstadt. And I can't even imagine how a blind person could fare in that environment. And I have a picture of her on my desk.
Do you remember the broadcasting of the Eichmann trial? Did your family watch that? Did you know?
I don't know if we watched it, but we certainly knew about it, and oh yeah, we read about it in the newspaper. I don't know whether we listened to it. Maybe, yeah. But yeah.
What educational path did you follow?
Yes.
Following public school?
Well, after public school, I went to Stuyvesant High School in New York City, which is one of the premier high schools in the city. And you had to take an entrance exam to go there. And after that, I went to the City College of New York, where smart, indigent Jewish boys and girls went. I think 80% of the population were Jewish, because there were no fees to speak of. And I got a bachelor's degree there, and then I went on to Columbia University on fellowships and scholarships that really didn't cost us anything. And I studied economics, and I got a master's degree from Columbia in economics. And you know, I regret not ever having a campus experience. I went to class, then I took the subway home, probably did most of my homework on the subway, and then went to Paula's Lebkuchen. And after my master's degree, I pursued the PhD, which was a doctorate degree in economics, also at Columbia University. And as I said, it was financed largely by fellowships and by scholarships. So I did that, plus working at Paula's Lebkuchen. So when I graduated, I was looking for a job, and jobs at teaching economics, which is what I wanted to do, were very, very scarce. I couldn't find a job. But there was the new economics department that had been established at the insurance company in Newark. I fill it in when my head allows. Anyway, I got a job as an associate economist, stayed there for about 10 years, and worked my way up to chief economist of the Prudential insurance company. And after that time, I decided that was not the right career path for me, that I wanted really to teach. And I got a job at New York University's Graduate School of Business as an assistant professor of economics and finance. And I was there for quite a while, and then Prudential called me back and I said I would was going to stay in teaching, but I would be a consulting to the. So I was a consultant to the economics department at Prudential. And then came along an offer that I couldn't resist. I had an offer to become the senior vice president and chief economist of the New York Stock Exchange. And I took that offer, and I was 20 years with the New York Stock Exchange in that capacity. And then I took early retirement and went back into teaching, which I always wanted. And I got a tenured chair at Pace University in New York City. It was the same commute I had going to the New York Stock Exchange, which was a plus. And I was going to teach there for maybe 4 or 5 years. And it turned out that I stayed at Pace teaching and running a center for the study of equity markets. And later they called it the Freund Center for the Study of Equity Markets for 18 years. Then I finally took retirement, and here I am.
Along those years, were you married?
I was married. I was married for 60 years, happily married, had 3 children, and unfortunately, my wife died 12 years ago, and I've been missing her every day since.
Please tell us her name.
Her name, Judith. Well, that's a story about that. She was born in Germany, and she was my first cousin. But I didn't know her. They lived in Alsfeld. I lived in Nuremberg. I do have one photograph of the two of us together in our when we were children, small children. And they emigrated to Palestine, to Haifa, and I never saw her again until after World War II. My parents invited her to come and visit us in America. That was the first time we met again since childhood. And we fell in love. And against the wishes of my mother, who was firmly opposed to our getting married, we married anyway. And we have 3 wonderful children.
They are?
Nancy, Heller, Sandra Kuhnli, and Hugo Freund, the son, who was named after my father, Hugo. And they're wonderful children, but I am alone. Yeah.
Do you, over the years, have you either read consistently about the war or seen films about the Holocaust, or have you stayed away
No,
from it?
I have, good question. I have both. My wife, who, as I said, also was an immigrant from Germany, and I stayed away from everything Holocaust. We didn't want to be reminded. I have never been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, or the one in New York that I think you're on the board. We saw a movie about I forget. Anyway, we saw a movie about the Holocaust that we walked out of. So both of us have deliberately made an effort to avoid Holocaust stories.
Have you ever spoken to groups? To kids?
Many, many, many times I've taken it upon myself to speak to groups because I think it's a worthwhile mission to tell people about it. And on December 5th is my next talk. It'll be in Summit, New Jersey, to a group called the Old Guard. There'll be about 100 people in attendance, and I have a PowerPoint presentation that was prepared actually by my daughter Nancy. She did all the illustrations.
Well, doesn't that remind you of what you went through, and how does that differ from films or books?
That's my story. It's not somebody else's. I'm well aware of my story. I don't want to hear other people's.
It's been a month today.
Is that? Whose phone is that?
Pause for 1 second.
I was starting to ask you about, this is a month since the attack by Hamas in Israel. It's 1 month. Can you tell me what your reaction was to that and what you felt in the last month?
On October the 7th this year, Hamas, in an incredible display of barbarism, killed 1,400 Israelis. Then after they shot them and killed babies, they cut off their heads. The Israelis had no alternative but to defend themselves, which they are doing. I know there is a worldwide agitation right now for some sort of ceasefire, which the Hamas can get. All they have to do is release the hostages. It's really up to them for a ceasefire if that's what they really want, but they don't want that. They don't seem to care about their own people. They certainly don't care about Israelis.
Where were you when you found out?
I was here at home reading the newspaper, or watching television. Yeah. So I don't see what option that Israelis have if they want to remain a viable Jewish state.
How do you feel about the wave of anti-Semitism on campuses, including Columbia,
Yes.
private schools, all around this country, around the world?
Yeah, you're quite right. It is very upsetting, particularly in light of my own experience with anti-Semitism. I wouldn't like to see this repeated. In fact, last night, as I was having dinner with my daughter, I asked them, what if this happened in America? What happened in Germany? Not out of the totally out of the question, And they said, you know, my children have a German passport. The story is, since I was a German, was born there, had a German passport, my children are entitled to passports. And I remember I got a letter from the consulate, German consulate in New York, and it said, "We are restoring your citizenship, and if you want a passport, let us know." This was, I don't know, 5 years after the war. And so and your children, your grandchildren, even your great-grandchildren can get a German passport. So at that time, I called my children and I said, I remember I said, "How would you like to become a Kraut?" And of course they laughed at me and said, "We don't need it, we don't want it." But they put their heads together later and they said, you know, a German passport entitles you to an EU, European Union passport. And that would might be helpful. And so some of my children, but not all, have acquired a German passport. What was your question again? Where did we start on this? Forgive my age.
I was asking you about what we can now refer to as 10/7, about the attack in Israel.
Yeah, well, yeah, so I asked the kids, what if it happened in the United States? My daughter Nancy has been studying German. She said, well, she can't go to Germany because her husband won't go there, and there are too many ghosts in Germany for them to live there, if should that become necessary. And of course, the best thing would be an English-speaking country, maybe Canada, but Canada is likely to close its doors should this happen. So maybe Scotland. And we sort of said this in jest, but I am sincerely concerned and worried about what is happening in the United States. And I am worried that we will abandon our form of democracy and deprive our citizens of their democratic rights and liberties. Having gone through so much of this elsewhere, I would not want this repeated here. But it is a sad story in many respects, what's happening here. Ah, yes, and we started out by saying my reaction to anti-Semitism on the campuses. And that is certainly a source of concern. And the colleges, by and large, I believe, have not done enough to counter anti-Semitism on the colleges. And they certainly haven't, what they've done has not been decisive enough.
In some countries, it's illegal to promote hate speech. We have rights of speech here in America. How are you going to uphold that and then try to protect people from hatred?
We also have a history of racist speeches, not against Jews so much as earlier on against our black citizens.
We have that history, Mr. Freund.
But we have,
What about Father Coughlin?
how about what?
What about Father Coughlin? What about the anti-Semitism in this country?
Yeah, well, it is very serious. And the colleges, as I said, particularly can do something about that, hate speech.
How do you quell hate speech and protect free speech?
There's, who says that hate speech has to be tolerated in order to maintain free speech? You can have debates about intellectual debates if you wish. But a democracy does not require tolerating hate speech.
What is your hope for Israel?
What is what?
What is your hope for the state of Israel?
They're fighting for their life, for their existence. I see that some Israelis are in fact leaving. And you know, at one point when I talked to my girls last night, I said, you know, in the past, you might have said if fascism comes to America, you'd go to Israel. But I don't think now that would be the case. In fact, I have seen that some Israelis are in fact leaving Israel. So, yeah, very much concerned. They're fighting for their lives. And I sure hope they win. I sure hope they eliminate Hamas and find a suitable successor. No small tasks.
Before we close the interview, is there anything you'd like to say to your children and your grandchildren?
Well, I hope they maintain the traditions of the Freund family, both religiously and otherwise. And I hope that they will be successful and bring honor to all of us who now call themselves Freunds.
Thank you very much.
This is a picture of my immediate family. It's my father Hugo Freund, and then when I was a kid of maybe 5, and my sister Margot, who was 2.5 years older than I, and this is my mother, Paula Freund, born Grünstein.
And where was this photograph taken?
And this photograph was taken in Nuremberg all those years ago.
Thank you.
Wow.
This is a picture of me on the first day of school, and I am carrying what they call a Schultüte, a school bag filled with candies. That's to make it easier for the child to go to the classroom for the very first time.
Thank
and it
you.
was taken in Nuremberg.
Thank you.
This is a picture of the shoe store operated in Miltenberg, a small picturesque town on the Main River, and I'm standing outside that shoe store, and I accompanied by my cousin, who was in Israel. I don't remember the name now.
That's you in the doorway. right?
Yes, me in the doorway, yes, and the shoe store was operated by my grandmother because she, of course, she was a widow, and she fended for herself very successfully. She died in Israel many years ago.
Thank you. My finger?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. We're rolling.
Bill, what is this?
This is an old prayer book with the date of the inscription 1864, signed by my grandfather, Liebmann Freund. At that time he was living in Aschaffenburg, and he signed it, and it was customary to inscribe the death of their spouses in a prayer book, and that's what he had done.
Thank you.
This is the SS Georgia, Cunard White Star Line, the boat that we came on to America. It left Le Havre in France and arrived in New York City at the New York City Pier.
Thank you.
This is a portrait of myself with my very dear wife, Judith Steinberger Freund, who left me 12 years ago and left a big void in my heart.
Thank you.
This is a memorial to my dear blind aunt Carolina Lehmann, who perished in the Holocaust. And throughout Germany, in many of the cities, they now put a Stolperstein, which translates as stumbling stone, in the floor next to the house they occupied before they were murdered. And Carolina Lehmann, was born in 1878 and deported to Theresienstadt, where she died.
Thank you.
My father had the hope that he could make a go of it in America, manufacturing and selling toys. He brought this car to America because it was a wind-up toy and would never leave a tabletop. And you can see in the back the wind-up hole. He had great hopes for doing this and making a fortune in America, but it didn't work out. There was no interest in the car. America made different kinds of cars and nothing like this.
Do you remember the name of the car?
All I know is it was made by Schuko, a German toy factory in Nuremberg, the toy capital of the world.
Thank you.
This is an article which appeared in New York Herald Tribune newspaper around, I would say, 1941. No, I'm sorry. Can you just start again?
Just keep going, just keep going.
No, it was,
The late 30s?
no. Yeah, it might have been around 1940, 41. And it was about Paula's Lebkuchen. And in a way, it put the firm on the map. It was widely read and widely talked about. And it shows my mother, Paula, and myself preparing a tray of Lebkuchen for the baker's oven. Actually, I have to tell you, this was staged. I never helped in baking Lebkuchen. I was too busy in the office helping out there. My sister, Margot, should have been in that picture, but she happened not to be around when it was taken. Anyway, it was written by the foods editor, Clementine Paddleford, and it just made a huge difference in the sale of our Lebkuchen.
Thank you.
This is one of the typical tins we use to package Lebkuchen, and since most Americans didn't know what Lebkuchen were, we called it Paula's Love Cakes. Actually, if it were a translation of Lebkuchen, it would have to be not Lebkuchen, it would have to be Liebkuchen. So I don't think that's quite accurate, but it was okay for the American market. We also had tin cans, round tin cans, beautifully embossed, but we don't have any left to show you.
I understand that, if I'm correct, that people were urged, once the war started, to buy these and send these to the troops in Europe.
Mm-hmm. We advertised that,
They
yes.
did, yeah. Thank you.
I wrote 2 children's books, let's say from ages 5 to 100. This one is called The Cookie That Saved My Family, as you can see, the story of Paula's Lebkuchen. And a little commercial, it's available for purchase on Amazon. I wrote a second book, The Towel That Saved Elizabeth, which is also a true family story. How one Jewish girl saved the life of a Gentile girl from drowning in the Main River, also on Amazon. We had other items of Judaica, but we didn't bring all of them to America. The one we did here on the one side is a spice box we used in a traditional way for the ending of the Sabbath. And the other item is a cup, a wine cup, also brought over from Germany at the time of our emigration.
Thank you very much. This concludes the interview for the USC Show Foundation with Mr. William Freund.
Thank you. You've done very well conducting this interview.